Yeah. Yeah. And to follow up that question is why do you think their story is important in the Christmas story? Why is their part important?
They weren't Jewish.
They derived from the same scriptures that the Hebrews should have derived from, that this was something significant, and yet they chose to respond, and many that were in the region chose not to.
Yeah. Great answers. And I will be getting a little bit more into it. So I guess now we're going to start with who were the wise men. And I'm going to open up with Matthew chapter 2. We have about 12 verses that really is all we know of the wise men. But I believe there's a lot more that we can pull from just these 12 scriptures. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea. They replied, This is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means among the rulers of Judah, and out of you will come a ruler and who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found them out from the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Now, as far as information as we get on these guys, like directly, this is all we have. But there is so much there's so much here that you can talk about just in these 12 scriptures. It's like, first and foremost, wise men, who were they? Again, we don't have a lot to go off of, but we know they were the wise men or magi. I notice when I practice this, I use both of those interchangeably. So if I use magi or wise men, they're the same thing. Just precursors. Nobody gets confused. We're from the east. The scholars, they think it's likely Persia based on the descriptor and like where Bethlehem in the land of Judah is. And they also likely had some familiarity with Jewish prophecy in some regard. And that's also why they think it's Persia, because of the heavy influence that Hebrew culture had on Persia. But they also have a very incredible role that we don't talk about in the Christmas story. We don't talk about as often. In all accounts, and it is a lot of the accounts we have about who they were directly or how many there were or whatever are all extra biblical sources, meaning that they're not in Scripture. So we make a lot of inferences about them. But regardless of whether or not who they were people from a far-off land who were trying to seek the truth, who likely knew little about the ways of God aside from prophecy, but they wanted to find the truth. And up until this point, the people of Israel were the only chosen of God's people.
Right.
But this showed that God was for all people, including the Gentiles. And it's interesting to look at, too, because we often attribute a lot of credit to Mary and her faith and, carrying Jesus and raising him. We also attribute a lot of faith to Joseph and him raising a child that seemingly wasn't his. But I even think we speak even less of the faith of the Magi. We so often will highlight Mary, Joseph, the other characters in the story, look at this great faith they had. And since the Magi tend to have such a passing, very brief moment in the Christmas narrative, I think we forget that we forget to really talk about them in particular. Because, modern depictions of the manger scene, we have 3 wise men at the manger, which seems like most people here touched on it, but there wasn't actually 3 wise men. We have no idea. There was 3 gifts. There was the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but we're not sure of how many wise men were actually there. And secondly, even though that we have traditionally depicted them at the manger, they weren't there the day he was born. They took a very long journey to get there. I think the guess, I think the guess is that he was around 2 or 3 years old, like whenever the Magi finally made it to Jesus to visit him. Which, that being said, is that they had to take a very long journey to get there. Because they followed the star as it appeared in the sky. And Scripture states that the star was over Bethlehem when Jesus was born. So I'm assuming there was a lot we don't know about the particular parts of their journey. Assuming they left the moment they saw the star, they would have had to easily been traveling for 2 or 3 years. Because we wouldn't think of that distance being great. Because we don't think about traveling as often, right? Because, we have cars. We can go get in a car, and we can go drive somewhere, an hour away. It's 60, 70 miles away. And we don't think of as much of it. But during that time, 60 miles was several weeks. Typically, they kind of put it also in perspective, is that everyone, assuming most of us live in Georgetown, but if we had our Georgetown community, someone here moved to Austin during that time when they had the same technology, we would likely never see them again, or really ever talk to them ever again, because that distance, even that what we think of as trivial, 20 miles, is such a great distance. So for them, they had to travel years, likely hundreds, maybe thousands of miles to get to him. And so the amount of faith that it would take to see that star and go follow after it is immense, because they have no idea fully where this leads. Because even in some regard, yes, the Scripture says that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, but they don't see it. I established, they weren't there at the birth. There is absolutely no way that they could have known. So to take that step, to take that journey, is immense. It's something that you have to just go on faith. Because also then too, taking that journey would come along with danger. Because again, we think of it's traveling, we don't really think about it as much. Yes, you can get in a car accident and it'd be horrible and whatnot, but they would be traveling in caravans very slowly, typically, which was opened up to bandits, opened up even to getting sick on the road. There was so many things that could go wrong, yet they persisted. And then even though they persisted, even with no end in sight. And that's kind of, when I was studying for this, it just kind of came to mind, but it's like us, at least as a church, looking at the building project. We know the end goal, but we have no idea how we're going to get there at the moment. We may have a plan, but we have no idea how everything's going to come together yet. And That's what we have to take a step in faith. And so what the Magi had to do was travel in faith. And I think we underestimate or don't talk about having that kind of simple faith as much. Like the ability to have that kind of faith is an amazing in and of itself, because we like to do the look at everything, look at our finances, look at our problems, look at whatever it is, and say, oh, that's impossible, or oh, that's crazy, or oh, that's stupid. And we get caught up in the here and now, and we trust in what we can see rather than what we can't. And we have this hard time just living for God day to day. And again, we find some sort of excuse to not do what God's asking. Along the way, we say that it's pointless. We say, God, that makes no sense. Or we focus on just the wall in front of us. So what can we learn from the Magi in this particular instance? And it's just to have faith.
Right.
Like a child.
Right.
Even Jesus later in Matthew, he speaks on having childlike faith. And I have to wonder, if you want to pull up the scripture, it's Matthew 18, 2-4. And I have to wonder, and even though he wasn't referencing the Magi in particular, I have to wonder if he was thinking about them. To have that kind of childlike faith. He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. He said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes a lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Right. And I have to wonder, again, Jesus didn't directly reference the Magi, but I have to wonder if he thought of them. Because they exemplified this in every way. They could have had every excuse to turn back. I'm sure on their journey, being as it was several years, which also to mention, being that it was several years, when you travel, you go one way, you have to take that back. Right. So it's like 6 years. Like, you just imagine being on the road for at least a solid 4 to 6 years. I don't think anyone wants to be doing that. Right. And they had every excuse to turn back. The conditions likely got hard. I'm sure they could come up with any excuse. It's easy to come up with excuses. But they still persisted. They still moved. They still moved on. The simple faith. And I want to speak on the gifts as well. We touched on it at the beginning, talking about gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Right. And, beyond, and I'll get into it here in a second, the Bible, the gifts themselves had a meaning. Like, each individual represented something during the time of during biblical times. Each gift represented something, and it meant something. But I think it went beyond just these necessarily being able to afford these gifts. And I'll get to what I mean to that in a second. So first, gold, biblically gold, represented one's kingship, deity. It was a sign of veneration to own gold in any sort of manner. Second, frankincense symbolizes worship and the future role. I believe, when I was researching, I believe they used frankincense to anoint high priests and whatnot in the temple. And so it represented him becoming a teacher and the high priest. And lastly, which this is an odd gift to give a toddler, but myrrh, if you really look at it, this is a really weird gift to give a 3-year-old. It was a burial spice. Myrrh was a burial spice. And it foreshadowed the day he would die on the cross. But based on the gifts, we also believe the Magi knew of the prophecies and whatnot, so they gave specific gifts that had meaning. And that's what I kind of want to focus on as well, is that they gave gifts that had meaning. And being the fact they could afford these things in the first place, we could assume that they were men of likely some sort of great wealth in some regard. They had to have had some sort of prior wealth before coming to Jesus. This was something. So they could afford. Effectively, they could afford anything they wanted. Right. They could effectively, probably they could have even handed him a giant bag of money. I don't know what their currency was at the time, but they could have handed him a giant bag of money, and they'd been like, "Here you go," and they would have thought that was a great gift. But they didn't. They were intentional. They were intentional with what they did, and I kind of want to put that in a more modern context. So, as we established, the wise men didn't do it to. I don't believe they did it to flaunt their wealth. Right. These particular items weren't given out of. They weren't given out of like, look at how great I am or how great we are or whatever. But they were intentional, and so in this day and age, we've seen it. I've done it, so I'm not calling anyone else here, but I've done it. We try to give and volunteer our time in the church, which are great. I'm not speaking against that at all. But I want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer this to yourself honestly. Are you doing what God has asked you to do? Because sometimes God will ask us to do something, and we'll begin to argue with him. And you say, God, I don't have time. God, I don't want to give that job. God, this is just too hard. But I'll do this instead. But I'll do this instead. So instead of doing the thing that you were asked to do, now you start volunteering more of your time or giving more of your money or doing everything but the thing that God has told you to do. Now, again, not saying either of those things are bad. It's just when you begin to ignore what God is telling you to do, you start running into issues. Because no matter how much you give, no matter how much you give of your time, you give of your money, whatever it is, no matter how much you give will replace the thing that God has told you to do. Obedience is perfectly stated. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And over the coming years, and I mentioned it earlier with our building project, but you're going to be asked to likely be do some things that are uncomfortable. And that'll look different, obviously, for each and every person. But this is the time as the church to come together that we can get the building project done. And it may be uncomfortable, but this is the time to band together. And God is about to move in a big way. And I want to see every one of you come along to be a part of the thing God's building here in Georgetown. And be intentional about what you give. Because your lives will be so much richer for it. Because, the thing is too, is that when you give and you give and you give, again, giving's great, but if you're not obedient, you'll never truly learn, you'll never truly grow. Because if you keep fighting the will of God and you keep fighting the things that he's telling you to do, you will never truly be able to grow in the kingdom like you're supposed to. You need to be obedient and humble yourselves, much like the wise men, the Magi. Now, moving on, we can talk about the actions of the wise men in parallel. If we look at it fully in depth, we could draw several biblical parallels and be here for a much longer amount of time. And we spoke on the immense faith of following after the star. They trusted in doing so, and in doing so, they fulfilled Scripture. They fulfilled the prophecy back in Isaiah and Psalms and Ephesians. Several scriptures throughout the Bible they fulfilled by what they did. Their presence indicated a shift. This was the time to bring the Gentiles into the fold and create the church. In Exodus, the Lord provided a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to lead them out of Egypt, to lead them home. The Lord provided a star for the Magi, guiding them home, because they were so hungry for the truth. They were so hungry for the truth and to find the truth and find the King. And we as a church need to always have that hunger. As the Magi could have easily brushed off the star. It could have been a very easy thing to do for them. Say it was merely some cosmic event that had no significance necessarily and ignored it. But they didn't. They followed after it. Much like Abraham, God called him out and he answered. And even if it doesn't make sense, follow God's direction. He has everything under control. Because, again, God moves in so many ways that we cannot see, that we cannot fathom, but we just need to simply trust like the Magi did. And it's amazing, and I think it even proves it further, is that these events, the journey of the wise men, and events even from the Old Testament seem to coincide or parallel with each other. God orchestrates these events thousands and thousands of years apart. He foretells prophecy. He sets these things up. And it's amazing how he does it. And I say that to ask you the question is that if the God that can orchestrate those events, if he can do that, why can't you trust him with your money or your job situation or your time or whatever issue you're coming up against? Why can't you trust him if this is the God that can orchestrate events through thousands of years? And the church is called to seek Christ with the same diligence as the wise men. And they were one of the first to make a big journey. They were some of the first believers to make the big journey. And we need to follow after that. We may not see the end goal, but we need to follow after that. We as the church now, instead of there being a star to follow, instead of there being some miraculous sign, God has put the church here. God has put you and I here in order to help guide people home. Because we have the truth that the world so desperately craves. Instead of a star, that job has fallen to you and I. And we have to live the way our lives to show them that we are different. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to be obedient, is that when you live your life in such a way that follows after God, being obedient and humbling yourselves, that begins to show to the world that there is something different about you. It's not an always comfortable journey. There are times that, you may feel like you're living on the edge and don't know what to do. You may be running out of money, running out of time, or you're coming up against something that just seems to have no end, or some giant or mountain. But it's worth it. It's worth it all. Because I've even found personally that, because I've done it many a time, and I'm only 25, and so I'm sure I'm going to make more mistakes. But I've done it so many times where God has told me to do one thing, and I'll completely ignore it, or I'll do something else in place of that. He's like, no, I told you to do this. And every time I've done it, I've grown just a little bit more. Kind of summarize and close here. What we need to learn from the wise men is just to have simple faith, to follow, to have obedience, and to trust in God. Because life isn't going to get any easier. Things aren't going to just magically get better all the time. But with God, you can trust.
Amen.
And you can have the faith of the Magi and follow after him. And you can trust that the end point will be good. And that's the end there. You have anything you want to?
No, I just, really, really good, Landon, and I think there's such a lesson. We want to plan, and we've got to have answers for everything before we move. We want to know how long is it going to take, and what all am I going to do, what do I need to take with me, and we don't know what all preparation they made, but we know that they had no idea what the weather was going to be like over those next 2 to 3 years. They had no idea what kind of trouble they were going to run into. They didn't have any idea about what kind of reception they were going to get when they got there. They didn't know any of that stuff. All they knew is that there was a star, and they had an unction from God to chase after that, and they did. And we hear the story now, here all these years later. I know there's a lot of distortions around the wise men, as there is all of the Christmas story. And we have this picture perfect, away in a manger scene with the wise men and the shepherds and the star and baby Jesus who never cried, which I still doubt too. But all of this stuff. But they simply moved on faith, and they moved because they were following a command to move. And I think sometimes we lock ourselves up, waiting for God to explain everything. And he says, what do I need to explain? I said, move. That's what you need. That's where the obedience is. That you need to obey. And we've talked about obedience all year, this year. And I think that's the real lesson from the wise men is obey and see what God's going to do, because they would have never seen it had they stayed where they were. They would have never seen it. That had never seen the child, would have never even known anything about him. And I've always wondered, were there others that were supposed to come that didn't obey? And we don't know who they are, because they didn't obey. They waited it out, they talked themselves out of it, and they didn't obey. And that's what we do so often, is we talk ourselves out of what God is saying, do. And we're going to talk to you here in a little while during the service. He had no idea what I was going to do, and I have no idea what Jonathan's going to preach, but I'm going to talk to you in a little while about being obedient and allowing God to speak through you and God to move through you. And so, great timing on the lesson, and give us a few minutes. We'll let the kids finish up in the back, and we'll get everybody back out front. Visit, be friendly. Good job, Landon.